Mesopotamia, Ancient Greek, Mesopotamia. Arabic, Bilad ar-Rafidain. Classical Syriac, Ramnan or Bet-Naran, is a historical region of the western Mesopotamia occupied modern Iraq. Historic areas also include the heads of the Persian Gulf and southeastern Turkey, western Iran, northeastern Syria and northern Kuwait. The Sumerians and Akkadians, including the Assyrians and Babylonians, dominated Mesopotamia from the beginning of written history, c. 3100 BC, until the fall of Babylon in 539 BC, when it was conquered by the Achaemenid Empire. It fell to Alexander the Great in 332 BC, and upon his death it became part of the Seleucid Empire of Greece. Then the Arameans dominated most of Mesopotamia, about 900 BC to 270 AD. Around 150 BC, Mesopotamia came under the control of the Parthian Empire. Mesopotamia became a battlefield between the Romans and the Parthians, with western Mesopotamia under mortal Roman control. In 226 AD, eastern Mesopotamia fell to the Sassanid Persians. The division of Mesopotamia between the Romans Byzantines from AD 395, and the Sassanid Empire lasted until the 7th century Muslim conquest of Persia from the Sasanian Empire and the Muslim conquest of the Levant from Byzantium. A number of native Neo-Assyrian and Christian Mesopotamian states existed between the 1st century BC and the 3rd century AD, including Adiabene, Osran and Hatra. Mesopotamia was the site of the earliest development of the Neolithic Revolution from about 10,000 BC. It has been identified as inspiring some of the most important developments in human history, including the invention of the wheel, the cultivation of the first cereal crops, and the development of cursive writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture. It has been recognized as one of the earliest civilizations the world has ever seen. One. Geography. Mesopotamia covers land between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, both of which originate in the Taurus Mountains. Both rivers are fed by many tributaries, and the entire river system drains a vast mountainous region. Overland routes in Mesopotamia usually followed the Euphrates because the banks of the Tigris River were often steep and difficult. The climate of the region is semi-arid with a large expanse of desert to the north giving way to a 15,000 square kilometer, 5,800 square miles area of marshes, lagoons, mudflats and reed banks. At the southern end, the Euphrates and Tigris rivers unite and empty into the Persian Gulf. Dry environments range from northern rain-fed agriculture to the south where agricultural irrigation is essential if energy surpluses returned on energy invested (ROEI) are to be obtained. This irrigation is aided by high water levels and by melting snow from the high peaks of the northern Zagros Mountains and from the Armenian highlands, the source of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that gives the region its name. The usefulness of irrigation depends on the ability to mobilize sufficient labor for the construction and maintenance of canals, and this, since the earliest period, has fostered the development of urban settlements and systems of centralized political authority. 2. A brief history. Prehistory of the ancient Near East begins in the Lower Paleolithic period. There, writing appears in pictographic writing of the Uruk-IV period, about 4th millennium BC, and documented accounts of actual historical events, and the ancient history of Lower Mesopotamia, begin in the mid-3rd millennium BC with cuneiform accounts of early dynastic kings. This entire history ends with the arrival of the Achaemenid Empire in the late 6th century BC or with the Muslim conquest and establishment of the Caliphate in the late 7th century, from which point the region came to be known as Iraq. In the long span of this period, Mesopotamia home to some of the most developed and socially complex countries in the world. This region is one of 4 river civilizations where writing is found, along with the Nile Valley in ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley Civilization in the Indian subcontinent, and the Yellow River in ancient China. Mesopotamia hosts historically important cities such as Uruk, Nippur, Nineveh, Ashur and Babylon, as well as major territorial states such as the city of Eridu, the Kingdom of Akkadian, the Third Dynasty of Ur, and various Assyrian kingdoms. Some of the important historical leaders of Mesopotamia were Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, Sargon of Akkad, who founded the Akkadian Empire, Hammurabi, who founded the Old Babylonian state, Ashur-uballit I, and Tiglath-Pileser I, who founded the Assyrian Empire. Scientists analyzed DNA from the 8,000-year-old remains of early farmers found in an ancient tomb in Germany. They compared genetic markers with modern populations and found similarities to the DNA of people living in today's Turkey and Iraq. Three forms of language and writing. The earliest language written in Mesopotamia was Sumerian, an isolated agglutinative language. Along with Sumerian, Semitic languages were also spoken in early Mesopotamia. Sabartuan, the Zagros language, may be related to the Hurro-Urartuan language family, attested in personal names, rivers and mountains and in various crafts. Akkadian became the dominant language during the Akkadian and Assyrian empires, but Sumerian was retained for administrative, religious, literary and scientific purposes. Different Akkadian varieties were used until the end of the Neo-Babylonian period. Ancient Aramaic, which had become common in Mesopotamia, later became the first official provincial administrative language of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and later the Achaemenid Empire, lect officially called Imperial Aramaic. Akkadian is no longer spoken, but both it and Sumerian were still spoken in the temples for several centuries. The last Akkadian text dates to the late 1st century AD. Early in Mesopotamian history, about the middle of the 4th millennium BC, cuneiform was invented for the Sumerian language. Cuneiform literally means wedge-shaped, due to the triangular tip of the stylus used to make marks on wet clay. The standard form of each cuneiform appears to have been developed from the pictogram. The earliest text, 7 ancient tablets, comes from a temple dedicated to the goddess Inanna in Uruk, from a building labeled as Temple C by its excavators. 4. Technology. The Mesopotamians invented many technologies including metal and copper working, glass and lamp making, textile weaving, flood control, water storage, and irrigation. They were also one of the world's first Bronze Age societies. They evolved from copper, bronze, and gold to iron. The palace is decorated with hundreds of kilograms of this very expensive metal. Also, copper, bronze, and iron were used for armor as well as various weapons such as swords, daggers, spears, and clubs. According to a recent hypothesis, the Archimedes screw may have been used by Sennacherib, king of Assyria, for the water systems of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and Nineveh in the 7th century BC, although mainstream scholarship considers it a Greek invention. Later, during the Parthian or Sasanian period, the Baghdad battery, possibly the world's first battery, was invented in Mesopotamia. The economy. The Sumerian temples functioned as banks and developed the first large-scale lending and credit systems, but the Babylonians developed the earliest commercial banking systems. It is comparable in some ways to modern post-Keynesian economics, but with a more anything approach. Agriculture. Irrigated agriculture spread south from the foothills of the Zagros with the Samarra and Haji Muhammad cultures, from about 5000 BC. In the early period until the temples of Ur-3 owned up to a third of the available land, decreasing over time as royal and other private ownership increased in frequency. The word NC is used to describe the official who organized the work of all aspects of temple farming. Villain was known to work most often in agriculture, especially in the grounds of temples or palaces. Trade Mesopotamia's trade with the Indus Valley civilization flourished in the early 3rd millennium BCE. Beginning in the 4th millennium BC, the Mesopotamian civilization also traded with ancient Egypt. See Egyptian-Mesopotamian relations. For much of history, Mesopotamia served as an east-west trade link between Central Asia and the Mediterranean world, part of the Silk Road, as well as north-south between Eastern Europe and Baghdad, the Volga trade route. Vasco da Gama's initiation 1497–1499 of the sea route between India and Europe and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 had an impact on this relationship. Governance. Mesopotamia's geography had a major impact on the political development of the region. Between rivers and streams, the Sumerians built the first cities along with irrigation canals separated by vast expanses of open desert or swamp where nomadic tribes roamed. Communication between remote cities is difficult and, at times, dangerous. Thus, each Sumerian city became a city-state, independent of the others and protecting its independence. Sometimes a single city would try to conquer and unify the region, but those attempts were resisted and failed for centuries. The Mesopotamians believed that their king and queen were descended from the city of the gods, but, unlike the ancient Egyptians, they never believed that their king was a real god. Most kings called themselves kings of the universe, or great kings. Another common name is shepherd, because the king must look after his people. Strength. When Assyria grew into a kingdom, it was divided into smaller parts, called provinces. Each was named after their main city, such as Nineveh, Samaria, Damascus, and Arpad. They all had their own governor who had to make sure everyone paid their taxes. The governor also had to summon soldiers to battle and supply workers when a temple was built. He is also responsible for enforcing the law. In this way, it is easier to control a large empire. Although Babylon was a fairly small state in Sumer, it grew rapidly during Hammurabi's reign. He was known as a lawmaker, and created the Code of Hammurabi, and soon Babylon became one of the main cities in Mesopotamia. It came to be called Babylonia, which means Gate of the Gods. It also became one of the greatest centers of learning in history. Military. When empires were created, they were more often at war with foreign countries. King Sargon, for example, conquered all the Sumerian cities, some of Mari, and then went to war with northern Syria. Many Assyrian and Babylonian palace walls are decorated with images of successful battles and enemies desperately fleeing or hiding among the reeds. Law. The city-states of Mesopotamia created the first legal codes, drawn from legal priorities and decisions made by kings. The codes for Urukagina and Pleated Ishtar have been found. The most famous of these is the Hammurabi, as noted above, posthumously best known for its legal instrument, the Hammurabi Code made circa 1780 BC, which is one of the earliest legal instruments discovered and one of the finest examples of this type of document from Mesopotamia. Ancient. He compiled more than 200 laws for Mesopotamia. Legal examinations show a progressive weakening of women's rights, and increasing severity in the treatment of slaves. That's a brief history of Mesopotamia quoted from Wikipedia.org. Hope it is useful. Thank you.